I know. Okay. Thank you, Cindy. All right. Let me do one more thing here. Okay. All right. All right. Again, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Vanessa Waters, and I am the McKinney-Vento Immigrant Grant Manager at the Tennessee Department of Education. For these slides and materials will be available after the session. They will be in e-plan as well as emailed to you after the webinar today. At the Tennessee Department of Education, we ground our work in our strategic plan, Best for All. The plan focuses on 3 priorities: academics, student readiness, and educators for all Tennessee students. As you all know, the work you are doing with students in transition is strongly connected to all 3 of these areas. Okay. So today we will briefly examine the McKinney-Vento program purpose and the definition of homeless under the Act. We will look at why collaboration and coordination are important. And then we will quickly look at several national organizations. I only pulled a few for our meeting today. And finally, we will hear from the National Healthcare for Homeless Council today, and then we'll have the closing with questions at the end. So quickly, let's look at the program purpose. Oh no, come on, computer. And the technical difficulties began. Okay, let's see here. Let's see if we can get this to, there we go. Okay. So the purpose of the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth, EHCY program, is to ensure that each homeless child or youth has equal access to the same free, appropriate public education, including a public preschool education as provided to other children and youth. So let's look at the definition under McKinney-Vento. Under the federal law, the definition of homeless is children or youth who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, including children or youth who are sharing the housing of other persons, living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or campgrounds, living in emergency or transitional shelter, or abandoned hospitals, living in a public or private place not designed for or ordinarily used for a regular sleeping accommodation, living in cars, parks, public places, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, bus or train stations, or similar settings, and who are migratory children living in the above circumstances. And as you can see on the slide there, I have fixed, regular, and adequate pulled out and highlighted so that you can go back and reference what fixed, regular, and adequate looks like for the definition. So let's talk about collaboration and coordination. Because the needs of homeless children and youth are so exclusive and they're varied, SEAs, state education agencies, as well as LEAs, must become part of a system of services to ensure that these children and youth are getting those services that they need to support them with their educational and academic needs. And so many of the organizations serving homeless children and youth and families have historically operated in silos due to limited time, their varying work cultures, and just different criteria based on what services they provide. And so coordinating coordinators and local liaisons should coordinate for several reasons. You want to be able to coordinate to determine eligibility across all agencies for those who are serving families that you may be working with, and then also to coordinate or expedite referrals for services. So as long if they know about your programming and what you do at your school, then that program can also collaborate with you in getting those services to that family. Maybe you missed a student just by pure coincidence. That student kind of got by the system there. That collaboration with that community-based organization or that national organization can help you get that student identified and get to those services. And then there are several federal programs that are required to identify and serve homeless children and youth. And they also have to meet certain federal guidelines, just like you as homeless liaisons and us as state coordinators have to also follow federal guidance. And so for collaboration, some of these federal programs would be Head Start, and then IDEA, HUD, and other housing programs, your runaway and homeless youth. And as you guys probably saw in the email I sent out, there's been a big push or a big grant funding released by ED for runaway and homeless youth. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at that. And then, of course, you want collaboration with your post-secondary education organizations. For example, your College Cost Reduction Act that will help with those post-secondary. So a few other federal programs would be the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. And so you want to make sure, again, that you're collaborating with all of those services. That way you're getting the most benefit for your homeless programming and any of those fundings that are available for your students that you serve. You want to make sure that you're also, when you're collaborating, whether it's at a national level or at a community-based organization, that you have all of this information in your MOUs and that you're talking about what services will be provided for your students that you are serving. So some of the ways that you want to coordinate, again, with community-based organizations or with your national partners, or your school supplies, your dental care, tutoring, mentoring, whether it be fees, employment for parents, mental health care. There's several things, again, you can partner with, again, with community-based or with your national providers. I encourage you to go back and look at this slide deck after this call today. And so, again, we're looking at the national organization, National Alliance to End Homelessness, the National Coalition for Homelessness. Again, these are really good organizations that you can work with within your community. It takes you kind of calling and getting to know who is in charge of your area in the state. We also have the National Network for Youth. It is to help your homeless runaway youth. And then the National Association for Education for Homeless Children and Youth, which is your NACY. And then today we have a guest speaker from the National Healthcare for Homeless Council, NHCHC, and they are grounded in human rights and social justice. Their mission is to build an equitable, high-quality healthcare system through training, research, and advocacy to help in homelessness throughout the United States. And she's here today to kind of talk to you guys about how you can support your homeless students through the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cindy. I'm going to stop sharing, Cindy, and then I'm going to see here. Reshare.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Good morning, everyone. It's really good to be with all of you today. I recognize few familiar names there of homeless liaisons that we've worked with in the past. And so it's good to see some of you again and lots of new faces as well. My name is Cindy Manginelli, and I'm with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. I would encourage you to check out our website, and it's at the end of my email address there, nhchc.org. Tons of resources at the intersection of healthcare and homelessness. And we have a unique grant with the Bureau of TennCare that allows us to do trainings like this and allows us to offer unique support to families experiencing homelessness in the state of Tennessee. So we'll talk more about this, but if you have families that you're engaging that need help with TennCare, that need help finding a provider, that have lost their TennCare and they don't know why, that need help renewing their TennCare, every family that's homeless, every family that has TennCare in the state must renew their TennCare this year or they will lose coverage in the next few months. So if we can help with that, I know there are some homeless liaisons that distribute our information to every homeless family so they have access to us if they need it. But that's a unique thing that we can do here in the state of Tennessee. And that's my email address. I will actually probably redirect you to Sandra Mooney on our staff now who handles all of our direct services with homeless families, but we would love to be of service to your families if we can. Before I came to the council, I did a lot of direct services myself. I worked primarily, I worked in a domestic violence shelter for several years as a children's counselor. I worked in a detox unit for women experiencing substance use disorder or coming out of incarceration. And we did some family reunification and worked with families in that setting. And then I also worked as a project manager in a clinic for refugees and immigrants. So I'm going to talk today somewhat out of expertise in that we do this nationally. We work with homeless families and support those who are providing direct services nationally, but also out of my own experience of what it's like for a school-age child who's experiencing homelessness and the barriers that they face as they engage their education and that their families face, but also specifically as you seek to support the health care needs of those families that you serve. That's probably not your primary priority or one of the first few things on your job description or your checklist as a homeless liaison. But we all know that when a family has a medical crisis, that drastically affects their ability to participate in school. It drastically affects their ability to get an education. It affects their teacher and their school. It affects the whole family. And that is uniquely the case for families that experience homelessness. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. The email server for the Department of Education would not let me send my slides. So we're doing this on a PDF. I apologize that it's a little clunky here, but I think you'll be able to get the message. All right, next slide. So I've got some pictures. These are not pictures of actual families. They're representing families that I've served. So I've changed the names and I've changed the pictures here just to kind of give you an idea to go along with the story. But of course, when most of us talk about homelessness, I think what we think about is Craig here on the left. And for 99% of the people that you interact with in our country, when we think of homelessness, we think of someone on the side of the road holding that sign, right? And certainly I find that there's a lot of misconceptions about people like Craig and why he's there and what his life looks like and what has caused his homelessness and the potential solutions to homelessness for someone like Craig. But the reality is that we don't think about people like Anna here on the right, Anna and her son, Andre. Anna ran away from home when she was a teenager. She had a boyfriend and they were madly in love and they ran away together and had many exciting adventures for about 3 months. And then they just kind of were consumed by alcohol and they both just kind of lost themselves in alcohol and an alcohol use disorder. And it just got, in her words, completely out of control. And about 3 months later, she found out she was pregnant and she stopped drinking, but her boyfriend did not. And right after she found out she was pregnant, about a month later, they had a terrible accident. And her boyfriend was killed. She broke both of her legs. It was a complicated sort of situation, and they had things in the back of the car that they had stolen, and it was a bit of a mess. And she ended up serving time in prison. When she got out of prison, about 3 years later, she regained custody of her son, who was born in prison, but Andre had been living with her boyfriend's parents, and they were devastated that she was going to regain custody of him. And there were complicated court cases. Eventually, she did get custody, but a few of those family members began basically hunting her down. And when I met her, she was in a high lethality situation where they were constantly searching for her. And so she was in a domestic violence shelter, and she was homeless. Anytime she put her name out on a lease, it made them easier to find her. And so with this, sort of complicated life story to begin with, now she finds herself homeless and doesn't know when she's going to be able to settle in one place because of her situation. When we talk about homelessness, the first situation that comes to mind are not situations like Anna's. People don't understand sometimes the complexities of homelessness, especially for families, and all the different factors, and the fact that those situations cannot be easily solved. Many of the families that you engage are like that. They may not have a story just like Anna's, but they have a story, and it's not as simple as you did these things wrong and now you're homeless. And if you would do these things right, you wouldn't be homeless, right? And so especially when we work with homeless families, we really have to sort of challenge some of those biases and some of those assumptions that we have about people that are homeless. You can also understand, if you think about Craig there on the left, that when Craig goes to the emergency room, obviously there are challenges that he faces, and people see him walk in and they assume things about him. He doesn't bathe very often. He doesn't wash his clothes very often. And you can imagine that the medical community makes a lot of assumptions about Craig and that he's had some pretty negative experiences. And that's kind of how we think about healthcare and homelessness often, again, as we think about what Craig's experience would be. But the reality is that when Anna engages the healthcare system, because Andre has medication he has to take for asthma, and because, of course, she wants him to receive that preventive care and to be up to date on his immunizations, and there are challenges that she faces as well. And it's a real struggle. There are many barriers that she has to move past, sort of literally and in her own heart and mind, to take Andre to the hospital or to take Andre to the doctor, and to sort of be put under that scrutiny and the questions that she's asked and the things that she has to explain, right? Same thing is true when she goes to enroll him in school. So that's what we're going to look at a little bit today. Next slide. So when we think about a family like this was just said, there's a lot of different ways that homeless families actually live, and each one has sort of its own challenges. Certainly shelters, and if you've never visited a homeless shelter, a family shelter, I would encourage you to do so. A lot of people have misconceptions about what a family shelter looks like and what's available to families there and what is not. Certainly there are housing programs, such as some places in Tennessee still use transitional housing, but permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, all different kinds of housing programs out there that have different requirements and that can be a little different. Doubled up couch surfing, where multiple families are living together, or where an individual or a family is kind of just going from house to house with people as long as they will keep them. Living in encampments. We used to almost never see homeless families living in camps, literally, tent camping. That used to be fairly rare. Coming out of the pandemic, when a lot of family shelters closed, and many families that were experiencing homelessness stopped engaging the family shelter, we saw a significant increase across the state of Tennessee in families actually living in camps. And that has not decreased significantly since 2020. And then, of course, in cars, storage units, hotels, things like that. And you can imagine all those things contribute to poor health outcomes as well as poor educational outcomes. Next slide. When we think about the barriers that families experiencing homelessness face, again, a lot of these things we would look at Craig and we would know that we would right offhand be able to list some of the challenges that he may face. But the reality is that homeless families sometimes struggle, sometimes even more. Unstable housing, and the reality that for many of the families that you serve, the fact that they were unstably housed contributes to poor health, and for many of them, their poor health contributes to their homelessness. I've worked with multiple families where this was the case. I met a family a few months ago, and dad is a roofer, and he fell off the roof. And they have 6 children at home. Mom stays home with the children. Mom doesn't speak English, so it's difficult for her to be gainfully employed. Once he fell off the roof, he had immediate emergency surgery. Many more hours of physical therapy and additional treatment was needed. But as soon as that emergency surgery was done, they realized his company realized he would not be able to come back to work. He lost his employment and he lost his health insurance. Within 2 months, they could no longer pay their rent and they were evicted. Because they were living in their car, of course, this exacerbated the injuries that he had received, and he wasn't able to have follow-up procedures, and he wasn't able to do physical therapy. And so his health declined even faster, which made it even more unlikely that he would be able to get another job. So you can see how, for many families, this cycle of there's some sort of crisis, and very often it's a healthcare related crisis, that eventually leads to homelessness, and the homelessness exacerbates the health issue, which then makes it impossible to get another job. And we see families stuck in this cycle all the time. Of course, insurance, resources, transportation. Very often families that have someone in their family with a serious medical condition, that not only makes it harder to be homeless, but it also makes it harder to go to the doctor. If you're taking your child to the doctor for a sore throat, but you know that your child's diabetes is not managed well because of your homelessness, it makes it harder to go to the doctor for a sore throat, right? Because I don't want to take my child to the doctor for the sore throat and they say, by the way, their diabetes is not managed well. Why aren't you taking care of this, right? Or why isn't he getting the therapy he needs for speech? Or why, having a pre-existing condition that a family is not able to manage well while homeless. I find many families won't seek even simple, strep throat treatment because they don't want to have to deal with this larger issue that they're not addressing or that they're not able to address. So again, all of that can be very cyclical. And as you look through this list, you can imagine all the different barriers that families that are experiencing homelessness face. Just the inability to just go home and rest. The complications of trying to rest in your car, of trying to rest in a crowded shelter, of trying to rest if you're sleeping outside. Even just that in so many ways affects health outcomes. Next slide. And of course, as we think about a child, a school-aged child, and the impact that homelessness has on that school-aged child, there's a long list here of ways that I've seen children and that we statistically know that children are affected by homelessness. We see a disproportionate number of homeless children diagnosed with ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. This is a very unofficial way of gauging this, but one year when I was working in shelter, I decided that every family that I encountered, I was going to make a mark, again, very unofficial data collection here. But I was seeing such a huge disproportionate number of children that had one of these diagnoses that I decided I was going to kind of just do a count and see. So every time I met a child in shelter, I made a hash mark, right? And if that child had been diagnosed with ADHD or identified as having autism spectrum disorder, I made the mark red. Very unofficial. At the end of the year, I found that 90% of the children that I had seen had been diagnosed with either ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, which statistically speaking is absolutely impossible, right? But the fact is that post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder in children exhibits exactly with the same symptoms as ADHD and with many of the same symptoms as autism. And so we find so many homeless children who are being who go to school and they're exhibiting these symptoms and they're being evaluated. And the evaluator, of course, does not ask, "Hey, are you living in your car? Did your son see his father arrested last night?" They don't ask about potential trauma that this child has experienced. And of course, parents are not offering that information for all the reasons you can imagine, right? Parents don't walk in and say, "Hey, before you test my child, you should know we sleep in our car," right? And so they're being evaluated using a standard that doesn't take into consideration the extreme trauma that they have experienced or that they are experiencing. And so we see an enormous percentage of homeless children who are diagnosed with these disorders and are medicated and who receive special education plans accordingly when the reality is They're just going through a really hard time, to put it very simply. So this is something to watch for and to think about and to talk about with your teachers and with your team, to think about how do we approach children who are homeless when they're exhibiting social dysfunction or emotional dysfunction. How do we talk about that when we think about evaluating them? For a lot of these children that you're working with, the school is their home. The school is the place of stability. The school is the place where things are predictable and safe, and where there's always food and where it's always warm. The school becomes often that safe, stable, consistent place. And again, that's something to talk about, the teachers that you serve, to talk about what does that mean for us. We see a lot of children who've experienced homelessness who have a lot of attachment issues, which is a huge issue that we won't go into a whole lot today. But very often these students will look to their teacher almost like mom or dad, or they have no ability to appropriately attach to anyone. So if, I want I want my teacher to be with me all the time. And yet I don't know how to be close to them. I may not even act like I like them a lot. Attachment issue is a huge issue, but I think we see a lot of poor attachment or inappropriate attachment among children that are homeless, and that can cause a lot of issues, specifically with their authority figures. A lot of mistrust, or they may really just constantly be deceiving those around them. We know that a lot of families experiencing homelessness, the children, don't want anyone to know that, or they may tell everyone that. They may exaggerate their situation and say that their situation is much worse than it is. That desire to have control over my own story, which these children really lack, right? The desire to be able to control your understanding of my situation, which my situation doesn't make sense compared to anyone else's, right? We're not reading any books during story time where the boy and girl are sleeping in a storage unit. We're not reading any books at story time where, the boy and girl are sleeping in the back seat and going into Walmart to use the restroom. That the context of their lives, they don't see that mirrored anywhere. No one else sitting at the lunch table has that story. And so children experiencing homelessness can very often be very aware that their story is different, and that can cause shame, and that can cause the need to recreate their story. It may, again, sometimes they may create a much worse story. So that, again, it's just that idea of control, but that can cause a lot of issues for children in school. Some children will create almost like a fantasy life of, I've had children who told me, they were princesses, or that they were superheroes, and would not let that story drop under any circumstances. They held to it in a way that was really dysfunctional, and that really affected their friendships and their relationships with their teachers. So that can be very complicated for school-age children. They can be very withdrawn or very aggressive. Many of these children lack the ability to ask for help. And we're going to talk more about that and how that can affect health outcomes. Of course, frequent truancy, as you just can't, unless you've been there. I think it's probably difficult to imagine how difficult it is to get ready for school in a homeless shelter. When you don't know when you'll have access to the bathroom, when you don't know, because you're sharing it potentially with dozens, some shelters, hundreds of people, the lack of control over when food will be ready, over, I've worked in shelters where you weren't even allowed outside until certain hours for safety reasons, high security domestic violence shelters. The inconsistency of so much of life. And so things happen, and you're in lockdown, so you can't leave. Just all the things that can happen that can make it so difficult to just get up and get out the door when you're living in shelter. I work with many homeless students who, once the sun sets, there's no light, or once the sun sets, there is very limited light. If your whole family is living in one bedroom, then when the youngest child has to go to sleep, there's no more light. Many of these shelters, families have to stay, mom and dad have to stay with the child at all times. And so the whole family has to stay together. And when the lights are out, the lights are out. Or we're all in this one room and the TV's on all the time. And because we're all in this room, I can't ask them to turn it off, right? So the limited ability to control your schedule, and even simple things like how much light you have in the afternoon and evening. Limited access to food, and what I really mean, it's fairly rare to see a child, even a homeless child, that's actually even severely, even moderately malnourished, to be honest, is a little bit rare. We typically in the state, we do pretty good of supplying people with food. It may be food that they're eating from a gas station. It may not be super high quality, but it is fairly rare to meet a child who, because of poverty, is actually starving or severely malnourished. Now, we may sometimes see that because of neglect, but even with children that are homeless that have food, many children, they stand in line for food. Their ability to pack their lunch or to have a breakfast or something is compromised simply because of the disorganization of the system that they're in. And then, of course, the complete inability to control their belongings, their clothes, their transportation, email communication, phone communication, all of that is compromised often for homeless families. Next slide. So you can see how all of those things would affect a child's ability to pursue their education, but also their ability to take care of themselves and for parents to take care of their children. When we meet homeless families, they are almost always just in survival mode, meaning how do we keep everybody alive? Almost that literally, right? Where are we all going to sleep? Where are we all going to eat? How are we going to keep up with everyone's clothes? Most shelters, you're allowed 2 bags. Sometimes 2 bags per family. So whose clothes, whose shoes do we keep, and which ones are we getting rid of? Whose favorite stuffed animal do we keep, and whose are we getting rid of? And you can imagine just that sort of crisis mode all the time, and the disorientation that causes. The disorientation when you don't just go home and there's your stuff, right? We do this sort of subconsciously. We come home, and your stuff is where you put it. It may not be clean and neat, but it's where you put it. You come in and your house smells like you, right? The sounds, the sights, everything with your senses, it's defines normal for you. And when you don't have that place, that hub, right? That headquarters for your soul, for your mind, for your body, that place where no one can ask you to leave. That place where you're always welcome. And you may have had times in your life where home wasn't that for a number of reasons. And the disorientation that causes, just the confusion that causes. Where am I now? Always needing to be on, always needing to be alert. I think that's really, with homeless children and families, one of the primary, that disorientation, the way that your head is just filled with so many details that we don't think about at all when we have a home. For many of the families that you're serving too, I think it's important to remember that for many of them, homelessness is rare and it's temporary, it's brief. When we look, like you think about at the beginning, at someone like Craig, while it is still hard, someone who's chronically homeless has often developed systems and routines that accommodate for the fact that they're homeless. So even though it's a system and a routine that's awful and that we might think is completely dysfunctional, there's still a system and a routine. Very often with families, the homelessness is unexpected. It's rare. It's like, what are we doing now? What happened? There's a shock factor to it. And families, especially with multiple members, really struggle to find that routine that, we're always looking for routine no matter where we are, no matter how difficult our situation is. Families really struggle to find that, especially with multiple members. The constant search for resources, that sense of shame that we talked about, of just what's happened, how are we here? If you have children that you love and care about in your life, you probably have some sense of that shame of, oh, I wish I hadn't said that, or that's not what I meant, or I wish I had the money for this, or I wish they weren't having to wear those shoes, or I think especially in Western culture, we really have all these expectations of parents, and we have this sort of sense of shame and guilt over not being able to provide whatever, and you can imagine the shame that comes when your children are homeless. And that shame can almost be disabling, just debilitating for a lot of parents, of just almost like being in shock. I think every family that I work with, their number one fear, almost across the board, is fear of losing custody. Am I going to lose my kids because we're homeless? Which leads to a lot of hiding, a lot of lying, a lot of covering up, a lot of trying to make up for. There's so many things that families do, like, oh my goodness, you're really hurting yourself by lying about this. And this drastically affects the parent-teacher relationship. It drastically affects the parent's relationship to the medical community, because parents lie to medical providers so they won't know that they're homeless because they don't want to lose their children. But medical providers can tell that you're lying, your story doesn't line up here, and that causes suspicion, which then really hurts them if they do end up having an open case with the Department of Children's Services. And they have to say, yeah, I lied about these 5 things, or yeah, we didn't receive preventive care because I didn't want to take him to the doctor. I didn't want the doctor to ask me all these questions. That fear of scrutiny is profound. What questions are they going to ask me? And how am I going to answer it based on the fact that we're homeless? Next slide. Things to keep in mind as we're engaging homeless families. This fear of losing, this shame, this fear of losing my child, the rejection I've already experienced, this fear of scrutiny. And of course, families that have a child with a mental illness or an intellectual disability, families where the child has a significant physical disability or a significant health issue, families where substance use is part of that family's story, or maybe mental illness with the parents is part of the story, families experiencing domestic violence. All of these families face really unique obstacles in trying to engage the educational system, but also in trying to engage healthcare. So many complications for families where the child has a chronic condition. And so really have to engage those families and think about how can we support you. And of course, there's a lot of stigma, both in the educational world, but also in the medical world, around families that are homeless. Many, many people that I talk to, as soon as you say, I'm working with a family that's experiencing homelessness, they automatically assume if a family is experiencing homelessness, they should have their children taken away, that homelessness equals neglect. That's what most of the world that we live in, that's what they automatically assume. And we have to remember that when we are engaging resources for the families that we serve, when we're helping them make appointments, when we're sending them, when we're referring them, we need to remember we're referring them to people who will more than likely think, if you're homeless, your children should be taken away. And we really have to keep that in mind and think creatively and talk with the family about, how are we going to tell your story? How am I going to advocate for you? Is a big part of that. Next slide. So let's look at some individual examples of some children. These are children that I've worked with, again, not their real picture, not their real name, and talk about, what does this practically look like? What does this look like? Well, all this that we just described, the barriers that families experience in engaging the educational system, the barriers that families experience in engaging healthcare and in taking care of themselves, the way families, the disorientation that families are experiencing. What does all this kind of look like? Let's look at a few examples of this in sort of real life. So this is David. David is 13 years old. And David has 2 younger brothers, and they live in a rural part of sort of Middle East Tennessee. And David's dad is a phlebotomist, and his mom has been a stay-at-home mom. She's worked some, and really from the beginning of his mom and dad's relationship, the dad, just even when they were dating, displayed some really significant mental health issues. And this was a family that I engaged, and this wasn't always the case in a domestic violence shelter, but this was a family where the father was, he had been diagnosed with an antisocial personality disorder, and he was absolutely a psychopath. And so mom would leave occasionally and stay with family members when things got really bad. And there were times when dad was gone, and he was just gone for long periods, sometimes even years. But dad had come back when David was 13. He's the oldest son, and he'd been back for about a year and a half, and things had just gradually escalated, and just unbelievable situation. But dad would tell David and his brothers, your mom hates me. Your mom's always trying to get me. He would actually draw blood. As a phlebotomist, he would draw blood from himself and put it in his ears and on his face. And then he would go to his sons and say, look, when your mom's mad at me, it's killing me. So I would say that specific manifestation of domestic of manipulation was extreme, but I saw many families like that, where one parent would so manipulate the emotions of the children. And so the children were really left going, who's the bad guy? For children, things are very, very black and white, right? You're either all good or you're all bad in a lot of ways. And so children were left really going, who's right and who's wrong? Because the two stories they were hearing were so extreme. The mom was also really hesitant to disrespect the dad or to dishonor him. And so she very often didn't in front of the children clearly say he's lying or he's manipulating you, because she wanted her sons to, as much as possible, have a relationship with their father. I hope this story exhibits some of the extreme complications of families in domestic violence situations. I work with so many professionals. When I say this, this family's in a domestic violence situation, they just say, why doesn't she just leave him? Or why doesn't he just leave her? And you can see in a family like this that she is hopeful. First of all, she loves him. She loves her husband. She has had many wonderful good days with her husband. He has done many wonderful good things for her and vice versa. And yet there's also this side of him that she can't explain and that's horrifying. And she battles that tension. Dad battles that tension. And they together don't know how to engage the children around that. And so you can see how for this family, so much confusion, so much deception, and mom being kind of stuck and the children being kind of stuck, really in some ways, everyone not really knowing how to proceed. And so I hope that gives an image too of just how complicated the emotions, the passions, the love, the hate, how these domestic violence situations can be so confusing for a child. Next slide. So you can think about that when David gets sick, David doesn't trust anyone. So when David gets sick, he can't tell anyone. He can't say, in the midst of all this, David got to shelter, and the first thing he did was he called the Department of Children's Services to report his mom, who he believed had kidnapped him. And we saw that all the time, especially with this age. So you can see he doesn't trust anyone. So when he's sick, he doesn't tell anyone, right? He's trying to protect mom, but he feels terrible if he's not loyal to dad. And so with school, with healthcare, with taking care of himself, all of that gets mixed up in that as well. He has a love-hate relationship to both of his parents. And because he's in a domestic violence shelter, much of his story has to be confidential. He can't tell his teachers where he's living. He can't tell his teachers this, but he's really afraid his dad will come pick up his brothers. So he's always watching, right? And his stories don't make any sense. And if he's sick or suffering, he doesn't tell anyone, right? So all of the complexity in a life like this, and we see different versions of this all the time. This idea of egocentricity, meaning that as a child, children believe everything revolves around them. And so if mom is unhappy, that's on me. It's my job to make mom happy. I must have made her unhappy. There's yelling, there's fighting, it's on me, right? So children tend to think everything's their fault, that everything revolves around them. And so you can see how that complicates all this as well. Next slide. Aaliyah was a 6-year-old little girl. She lived with her mom and her grandmother and 3 siblings in shelter, and they were homeless. Her mom really struggled with substance use disorder, and so her mom would be in and out of treatment. She was passed around to different relatives during that time. When mom would come out of treatment, of course, she was always homeless because she wasn't able to maintain a job. And so they were constantly starting all over. And Aaliyah lived with multiple family members. Next slide. Aaliyah had multiple siblings, people that she thought of as siblings, which made life very complicated too. And Aaliyah was one of these children that, because she'd been in so many homes and seen so many things as a 6-year-old, and she'd been in multiple shelters. She had been in foster care a couple of times, but typically she was passed around to different relatives. She had no concept of home. She had no concept of words like mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and aunt and uncle. These things all changed all the time. Even brother and sister changed all the time. So when you look at a child like Aaliyah, again, she was exhibiting significant symptoms of ADHD and some symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. She was always sick. She, of course, her diet was constantly changing. Her sleep schedule was constantly changing. Um, she was actually taken for immunizations twice, and so that scared some adults to death. Had no idea, is this going to have just you can imagine just the chaos, and how that affects her mind and her body. How that when she's sick, no one knows, when did she last go to the doctor? No one knows, does she have insurance, because her custody changes so much. And who has that documentation for her, right? So you can see how when she thinks about, first of all, she was almost constantly sick, which we see with homeless children quite a bit. She always had a runny nose. She always had a cough. She constantly had headaches. She constantly had stomach aches. And how much of that is stress? How much of that is diet? No one had any idea what she was actually allergic to or what she actually had sensitivities to. How much of that was just routine change? And so you can see when with Aaliyah's teachers, and they see her and she's still got a runny nose, and some teachers sent her home. Sometimes she was there, especially in times like this where people are very sensitive to others being sick. You can see all the complications that would arise for Aaliyah and how complicated it would be to try to support her. There's no stability in her life. And of course, she's always on guard, always wondering what's next. Or sometimes kids like Aaliyah will just be really shut down. Next slide. So this is Cameron. Cameron is probably the kind of student that is the hardest to help, and that's because Cameron is an unaccompanied minor. And when I met Cameron, he was 16. He'd been kicked out by his family. Again, some of these young people, when I would talk to Cameron, he would describe this big fight, and they kicked him out, and they hate him, and they never want to see him again. And I'd always try to talk to young people about, are you sure that's how they feel? Because sometimes I work with young people and they just feel like mom hates me. We had this enormous fight. There were threats. And sometimes we can go back and we can do some family reunification and find out, mom's really sorry about that. Sometimes not. Sometimes it's absolutely a permanent kind of situation. But Cameron, doing really, for a 16-year-old, he's got a job, he gets to school every day, he kind of couch surfs, and sometimes he would sleep in a tent that he had kind of made. I mean, amazing resiliency, just amazing young man. Next slide. But the reality is that because he's an unaccompanied minor, if he gets sick, he can't go to the doctor. And so he is very vulnerable. He's vulnerable all the time. He doesn't feel like he can ask anyone for help because he feels like if he calls the police or he goes to the emergency room, he's going to be put in foster care. And that's his greatest fear. He does not want to go live with strangers. And so when he's sick, he does nothing. When he's in danger, he does nothing. And this makes him extremely vulnerable. So even though he's very independent and he's functioning at a really high level, putting some of us to shame, he is incredibly vulnerable. Next slide. So I'm going to take some questions here in a minute. So I'd like you to think about if you have questions or comments. They don't have to be questions even for me, but you can kind of brainstorm together or think about what kind of situations have you seen? How do you find this to be true, or what questions do you have about that? As you think about specific students that you've worked with, that you've engaged. But I do think it's always good for us as those who are engaging, really vulnerable families, that it's always good for us to take a pause and to really think about, how do I feel about parents who are homeless? I've been doing this for years, and I still realize that I can work with a family, maybe get really involved with a family, and then I can realize that because that didn't go well, that I've become kind of negative. I can sometimes realize, I'm really sort of thinking that for these kids, it's hopeless. I've become sort of jaded, or I've become sort of, that I look at every homeless family. When I worked in the domestic violence shelter, I sometimes would I would see families playing at the park and think, well, I wonder what he's doing to her, or I wonder what she's doing to that child, or just awful things that would pass through my mind. And so I think we need to regularly have those. And sometimes I would realize that I was being extremely oh, that family's great and they're awesome and they're the best parents, even though they're homeless and living in their car. And I wasn't looking at it objectively, that I was just leave them alone, and like, wait a minute, are you really looking at reality and what that family is struggling with? And, I've just absolutely vehemently advocated for families and just had to stop and go, you know what? They are kind of neglected. You've gone too far both ways. I think we have the potential to swing too far. So to take some pause and say, what do I think about families that are homeless? What assumptions am I operating under? Am I in a healthy spot, a spot that represents reality with this family? What am I assuming, right? Am I setting good boundaries? And this is a whole nother training on, have I gotten too emotionally tied in? Am I really clear on what I can do, the services that I can provide, and what I cannot do? And what is someone else's to do? What is that family's to do on their own? These are questions I think it's good to always pause and ask ourselves. So I'll turn it back to Vanessa. I don't know if we have time for questions or not. I will remind you too that my email address is here. I'm always happy to talk more, and that we are always here to help families with unaccompanied youth who cannot seem to get TennCare on their own, families that are undocumented, that are really struggling finding a medical provider, families that have lost TennCare that need to renew TennCare. Please distribute our information. We're really happy to help. Vanessa?
Thank you. I'm sorry, guys. I'm coming back to our end here. Thank you so much, Cindy, for joining us. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and unmute your line or drop any questions in the chat box. I do appreciate you joining us today. I feel like a lot of times when I present to homeless liaisons, I am on the federal side of things, so making sure we're following federal law and resources for homeless liaisons sometimes may fall short, and really bringing us back into what's happening in the field and putting our perspective to those students and those families really was what we heard today from you. And so I do appreciate that. Do we have any questions from anyone? Again, unmute your line. I think I see some questions in the chat. Let's see here. Someone has their hand up. If you want to go ahead and unmute your line, because I only have one screen, I cannot see who you are.
Hey, this is Catherine Knowles in Nashville. Hey, Cindy, how are you? I just wondered if you
Catherine. Sorry, Catherine's awesome.
I just wondered if you could speak to kind of general access to healthcare across the state for undocumented families. I think, in Davidson County, we really struggle with that. And I'm just curious if there's anything creative going on elsewhere.
Yeah, what we're primarily doing is connecting people to healthcare for the homeless programs, although they may not be homeless just because they're undocumented. And so in that, in Davidson County, that's going to be neighborhood health, and Cherokee Health, and more in East Tennessee and West Tennessee, specifically in Shelby County, we look at like Christ Community and some of those, but it is a challenge. We do also have some resources like Salome Family Health Center here in Davidson County, Faith Family, and of course, very often the issue is waiting lists or families having to get there, at 6 o'clock in the morning and stand in line. But there are some healthcare for the homeless health centers across the state that we can refer you to for undocumented families. We do find that undocumented families are often very hesitant. So I've connected with undocumented families and then realized that they just didn't make that connection. And so we're really exploring what does it look like to look at like community health workers that would actually come out and meet with the family and try to alleviate some of those fears. So those are some things that we're kind of toying with. Looking at agencies that support refugees and immigrants in general, and how do they make those connections, or what connections do they already have with health centers? We see some of that in Davidson County, like with Salome Family Health Center and Faith Family. So I'm happy if you have specific families. I'm very happy to try to connect, across the state with the resources that we have, but those are the primary agencies that we're looking at. And of course, the problem there is if they need a specialist, if they're going to have surgery or something like that, that's non-emergency surgery, that is really challenging. But we do have a few health centers that we've been able to connect with, but sometimes there's a long wait and is certainly not perfect. Also, you might keep in mind, I know you know this, Catherine, that if a child is born in the state of Tennessee, they are eligible for healthcare coverage, even if their parents are undocumented. And that very often is families get scared about that, which I completely understand. But if that child is born in the state of Tennessee, they are eligible for TennCare regardless of whether or not their parents are, are legal citizens. So something to keep in mind there with that too. But feel free to reach out around specific families and we'll try to make those connections based on where you are in the state too. Again, a lot of that, sometimes when you refer an undocumented family to us, they get scared, they just back up like, wait a minute, national organization? I don't think so, and we have that happen a lot too, where that referral just never goes through because of a fear around that. But we will certainly try to help in whatever ways we can.
We are out of time, so if you have a chance to click on the survey, please let us know how we're doing at the department. We did have one quick question in the chat box. Is there identified month that families will be required to renew their TennCare?
TennCare is doing it just like they did a few years ago by last name. And so families will receive a renewal packet that is specific to them. It will be very confusing for families where there are children with multiple last names. This is going to be a tricky process. So I'm happy to talk more about the TennCare redetermination process. I'm also happy to share resources on that. Vanessa, I can send those to you. But it's going to be by last name. It's going to be, and so that's going to be really tricky. So Vanessa, I will share more resources with you that you can send out to the group as well. But that is happening starting now. So we do need to start getting that information out to families and watch, because unfortunately families will lose coverage. Big thing to do now, encourage all your families to make sure that TennCare has their correct address, their correct contact information, that they have downloaded the TennCare app if they have that technology.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Again, we appreciate you joining us. I apologize for taking a little over your time, guys. I will get with Cindy to get her slides loaded into my slides, and I will email everyone with all the information. Again, thank you for joining and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.